as the Iranian delegation, after the talk said, as you've heard from American quarters as well, that for people to expect that Saturday should have resulted in some realistic outcome was unrealistic. Because if you look at past records in history, if you look at the Camp David records, for example, or any other records or peace settlement, it has always not been within one day. It has taken weeks, months, sometimes even years for them to materialize sustainably. Uh, so the fact that these talks are going to happen and not going to happen, Islamabad is one of the top venues. Ankara, Riyadh, and Geneva are the other venues. But the fact that both there have been comments from both sides that say that the talks should be held in Islamabad. President Trump, one of the comments he has made is that Islamabad is the ideal venue because why should we go to other countries which have no direct stakes in the mediation process? So again, for Islamabad to be chosen as a venue and hopefully for the second rounds as well, um, is it shows how much trust both sides and in fact the whole region, because what we're seeing right now is it's not just Pakistan alone. Yes, Pakistan is heading the peace talks, but we see a collection of countries: Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, China, who have all converged and all collectively have put their trust in Pakistan. That's why Islamabad will most likely be the next venue, but right now it's not official.
And I think that's very, very important to note. Let's reflect back to those first round of talks. From your perspective, I think it was very, very intense. That's what at least the rest of the world knows and seems to understand. Apparently, it was 20 plus hours of negotiations. But from your perspective, being so close to the story, why do you think they ultimately failed? Why do you think there was no resolution at the end of those very, very long talks?
So while there was progress made, we have heard that there were direct talks between the Vice President J.D. Vance and the delegation from the other side, Khalibaf and Foreign Minister Arakchi. We also had technical meetings in a parallel room between the US and the Iranian delegates. The reason that there were a few sticking points. One of the sticking points was obviously the who would control the Strait of Hormuz, and the other one of the other sticking points was obviously ceasefire in Lebanon, and that sticking point had been there since before both parties reached Islamabad. In fact, so on 8th April, our Prime Minister he announced the ceasefire, but he had included Lebanon in the ceasefire. But a few hours into the announcement of the ceasefire, we heard from the Israeli quarters that Lebanon was in fact not part of the ceasefire. So if there is one spoiler in the room, it is not the US, it is not Iran, it is only Israel. And Israel was the spoiler in this case as well. Yes, Strait of Hormuz was a sticking point, uh, but ceasefire in Lebanon was another. They had sort of agreed on the other points. Uh, for example, the Iranians have demanded that their frozen assets, which amount to 220 billion dollars, should be released. There has been somewhat agreement on that, and also on the enrichment. There is room for agreement on that because, as evidenced by 27th February, a day before, hours before the attack, US Israel attack on Iran, we saw the Omani foreign minister's statement that Iran had agreed to curb its enrichment program. So, if I look at all the scenario before me, the one spoiler, the one sticking point is how to rein in Israel, how to have a guarantee that there will be no more attacks on Iran.
And I think that's very, very important. One thing that seems to be of concern, at least for me, is the fact that there seems to be a trust deficit between the two parties. Iranian officials came out and said they simply don't trust Americans anymore, especially after the previous talks were followed up by military escalation. How much of this trust deficit might shape the outcome of the next round of talks that could possibly happen in Islamabad, as you mentioned?
It's it's uh, it's one of safe to say it's one of the most important factors, because if you look at history, what happened in 2018? 2018, the JCPOA, the nuclear deal was signed between in 2015. The deal was signed between the US and Iran and the EU plus one members. So what do we see in 2018? President Trump unilaterally pulls out of the agreement without any cause, and so that agreement, that was the one of the first hits in the trust, if there was any trust between that Iran had on the US. Then during President Biden's time, we saw a number of rounds of negotiations on the nuclear file issue. In Austria, Vienna, it never amounted to anything. So, what happened fast forward? What happened last year? 2025, the talks were progressing very positively. What happens? We have right when the talks are on the cusp of being negotiated, Israel and later the US joins Israel, attack Iran. Trust broken again. What happened this past earlier in the year, 27th February, Dumani, foreign minister, he came on air, he commented, he made a statement that the negotiations are very successful. In a few hours, a deal will be signed again. What happened a few hours later? US Israel attack Iran again. So, safe to say, Iranians do not, they have this fear, and honestly, rightfully so, that they don't know if they may agree to a deal right now, but they don't know in a few hours maybe the deal is broken.
Mm,
But the fact that both sides have sent high profile delegations to Islamabad on Saturday, and in the upcoming talks, we are expected that a high profile delegation for both sides will converge in most likely Islamabad. That shows that there is some room, but both sides will come in as they did on Saturday with hardline stance. There's a major trust deficit. Yes, it does have a role to play, but I believe that curbing Israel at the moment, if there's a guarantee for that, that will help bridge the trust deficit that is.
very, very important to note. After those talks over the weekend, we saw an escalation, as I mentioned, one being the US Navy enforcing that blockade on the Strait of Hormuz. That factor in itself, how much of it do you think could add to both parties not necessarily negotiating in good faith or negotiating through the pressure of that reality? The fact that you have the US enforcing a blockade on the Strait of Hormuz, even though the Israelis said anyone and everyone that wants to pass through can.
So the fact that President Trump made the announcement that the Strait of Hormuz is blocked, and then CENTCOM came in with a statement that not the entire strait, just those ships that will be going to and from Iranian ports will be apprehended. So even though these are threatening, there were threatening statements from both from the US, from CENTCOM and President Trump. But again, I would but I've seen in the past also, just hours prior to the ceasefire announcement, we saw optic wise, public rhetoric wise, we have seen President Trump make statements against the Iranians that we will, abolish an entire civilization, and he has had deadlines which he has been extending from pressure from all the countries to, there should be mediation as well. So yes, the Strait of Hormuz is one point where he has tried to, enforce coercive diplomacy, but coercive diplomacy with Iran does not work, and especially when we have seen the Iranians put up a amazing resistance front in
Hmm.
face of aggression. So coercive diplomacy, where it might have worked with other countries as well, would not work with Iran. Secondly, saying that you have blockaded the entire Strait of Hormuz, it's next to impossible. It has never happened in the past as well, with other straits as well, with other waterways as well. So to say we have enforced a blockade on the Strait of Hormuz, even if it's ships going to and from Iran, is not possible.
Mm, mm, mm. Lastly, before I let you go, and I think this is very, very important for people that are listening and watching us from all over the world. What would you say leading up to those second round of talks are going to be some of the key areas that we should be looking out for, the key areas of concern or of development that could contribute quite dearly to this conversation, and whether or not those conversations in Islamabad for the second time do ultimately happen?
One of the key concerns and the sticking points, which is still a sticking point, is Lebanon.
Mm,
We saw that yesterday there were talks in this US State Department between the ambassadors of Lebanon and Israel, and the Marco Rubio was mediating between them. But again, Israel's aggression aimed aimed at Lebanon, yes, but mostly it is directly aimed at Hezbollah. Hezbollah was not part of the talks. So Lebanon, I think, will still be a sticking point because, again, as I've said, that there has to be a guarantee that the US, who is Israel's ally, will have to rein in Israel as well. If there is a guarantee for that, talks can proceed as they have before. The second point would be that both sides, yes, both sides are coming in with. Sort of not hardliner, but they're coming in a non-compromising. There is room for compromise on both sides, but they're trying to not show themselves as a weak side. There has to be room for compromise.
mm,
Third, you cannot uh, nuclear enrichment. Yes, Iran had agreed to in the past as well, recent past, in February as well, but to sort of use that as a sticking point again and again and again. For example, ballistic missiles was another thing. Iran will not compromise on its ballistic missile program because that is its deterrence. So these sites at the topmost, obviously Israel as a spoiler, then other issues are small compared to the Israel factor at this moment. And if that can be guaranteed, then the process will continue without a break, and we can hopefully in short due time, see some progress happen.
No, most definitely. Arhama, Siddiqa, thank you so much for joining us and for those
Thank
very,
you.
very important insights. Hope we chat again soon as the second round of talks, the conversation around them continues to gain steam, and hopefully there'll be an agreement after that. And I would really appreciate to unpack it with you even further. But we're going to leave it here for now.
Thank you.
There we go, Arhama Siddiqui, giving us, I think, very, very important insights on Pakistan's involvement on the second round of talks, well, second round of ceasefire talks between the United States of America and Iran. And yeah, Israel. and the war that they've ultimately perpetuated against Iran. It'll be interesting how that pans out because there's a very, very fragile diplomatic window here. I'm getting that sense. And there's very, very high stakes, I think, on both sides, but particularly for Iran, because while the talks may have stalled, the cost of failure is clear, not just for the region itself, but for the global economy, number one, and just for general security landscape. And we'll be watching quite closely how the story pans out, and if indeed those second round of talks do yield a positive outcome. Otherwise, going to take a quick break. News and views continues after this.